are three passages where Paul uses the word predestined. Many Christians interpret these passages to mean that God is in control of everything that happens. Let's look at those passages and see if that's really what Paul's saying. First, we have this in Romans chapter 8. For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he predestined, these he also called. Whom he called, these he also justified. And whom he justified, these he also glorified. God is all-knowing. Because he resides in eternity outside of time, God sees the end from the beginning. And that means that God knows how we will respond to him. God foreknew those who will receive him. But knowing something will happen is not the same thing as causing it to happen. That passage clearly says that God knew in advance that some would choose Jesus. And once they did, he then predestined them to be conformed to the likeness of Jesus. God does not arbitrarily destine some people to heaven and others to hell. Next, let's look at this passage in Ephesians. Just as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love, having predestined us to adoption as sons by Jesus Christ to himself, according to the good pleasure of his will, to the praise of the glory of his grace, by which he made us accepted in the beloved. There we see it says that God sovereignly decided that those who are in Christ should be holy and without blame and adopted as sons. It says that God chose those of us who are in Christ to become these things, not that God chose to arbitrarily put some of us in Christ. It's now the destiny for those in Christ which God has predetermined, not whether or not those individuals will be in Christ. Once people believe in Jesus, God predestines the outcome of their choice. People get to choose. They get to choose Jesus or reject him. Once they do that, God predestines the outcome of their choice. You see, we're free to choose, but the consequences of our choice are already set by God. Then there's this additional passage in Ephesians. In him we also have obtained an inheritance, being predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will, that we, who first trusted in Jesus, should be to the praise of his glory. This passage describes those who are already in Christ, not whether or not we're positioned in Christ. It says that we, who first trusted in Christ, are predestined to be to the praise of his glory. Again, it does not say that God predestines who will accept Jesus and who won't. God is not predetermined who will be saved and who's lost. Instead, God has predetermined the destiny of those who willingly believe and also the destiny of those who willingly reject his gracious gift of righteousness. That is, that God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself, not imputing their trespasses to them, and has committed to us the word of reconciliation. Therefore, then, we are ambassadors for Christ, as though God were pleading through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. As Paul says in that passage, God has done his part. Now Paul says, we implore you to be reconciled to God. Statements like this from Paul, urging folks to turn to God, only makes sense when we understand that God has not predetermined who will choose him and who won't, and who's going to reject him. It makes no sense for Paul to implore us to make a deliberate choice to be reconciled for God if Paul was teaching elsewhere that God arbitrarily makes those decisions for us. Let this be an encouragement to you. You have the ability to choose Jesus. Once you do that, God has already set the consequences of your choice, and the consequences of choosing Jesus are very good indeed.